All right, you guys ready to talk today? Yeah, I'm so glad that you're here, so glad to see you. If we haven't met before, my name is Rick. I have the privilege of being one of the pastors here, and we're kicking off this new series. It's called Welcome Home, and one of the reasons we're calling it Welcome Home is because we're talking about home life and the kind of conversations that we're going to have over these next few weeks. We want them to feel just restful and comfortable and safe. But there's another reason that we're also referring to this as Welcome Home. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a time that one of Jesus' closest disciples was throwing himself a pity party. You ever throw yourself a pity party? And he was just letting Jesus know, just reminding Jesus of all the things that we left to follow you, Jesus. And this is how Jesus responded. This is part of his response. I'm sorry, this was a typo. This is actually Matthew 19, not 17, Matthew 19. Part of Jesus' response to him was that everyone who's left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. And part of what Jesus is saying is that there's a benefit of when we follow him, we get an even bigger family. And we get maybe a richer family experience than we ever knew how to imagine before. And so that's what church should feel like. It should feel like family. And when we have this, throughout this series, it should feel like a family conversation. As we gather together and as we talk, it should feel like a conversation with people who you know love you and who have your back. Does that sound good? Now, next week, we're going to talk about the single life and dating. The week after that, we're going to talk about parenting. But today, we're going to talk about marriage a little bit. And this is a disclaimer. I wish I could stand up here and tell you that I'm a marriage expert. I'm not a marriage expert. If I'm an expert on anything, which I'm not, but if I was an expert on anything, I'd be maybe an expert on my wife. This year, we celebrate 25 years of hot, righteous monogamy together. And we were babies when we got married. Can you believe how young we were? I cannot believe the real adults actually let us get married. We had no clue what we were getting into. Year one of our marriage, we were on a road trip, and I'm driving, and Heather casually leans over to me and says that she needs to stop for a restroom break. What she was about to learn is that's not how I did road trips. My road trip mind, I don't know where I got this. My road trip mindset was we stop when the car needs to stop. And so I just said, babe, we stop when the car needs. I said it with all the confidence of a rookie husband. Babe, we stop when the car needs to stop. And she thought I was joking until I intentionally passed the next rest stop. Now, what I haven't told you is her mom and dad were sitting in the back seat. They didn't say a word. They did not say a word. Heather, on the other hand, she had some words. Short version of the story is I now stop whenever anybody wants to stop. I have stopped 2 exits in a row before. Now, I did not get into marriage wanting to mess up my marriage. And I bet you didn't either. Nobody really wants to, nobody starts off wanting to self-destruct their marriage. And yet every single one of us, isn't this true? Every single one of us, we bring mindsets with us that sometimes work against what we want. And you'd be right if you said, Rick, there are bad behaviors in marriage. There are. You'd be right if you said that there are bad habits in marriage. There are, but that's never the heart of the matter. The real heart of the matter is the mindset that we bring. I want to invite you to write this down and think about this with me. We are all, right now, we are reflecting, resisting, or redeeming our cultural influences. So I want to ask, how are you right now reflecting or resisting or redeeming the broader cultural influence on your marriage mindset? How are you right now reflecting, resisting, or redeeming the influence of the culture from your family of origin on your marriage mindset? How are you right now reflecting, resisting, or redeeming the influence of your religious culture and background on your marriage mindset? And here's the kicker. It's kind of scary. This takes zero effort whatsoever. Reflecting cultural influences takes zero effort and zero awareness. People do it ignorantly, unintentionally, all the time. But to resist or redeem those influences, it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of awareness. And that never happens by accident. So today, this is what I want you to do. I want you to grab a Bible. You can use your phone. Either one is great. And we're going to turn to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. Now, as you're turning there, I want to let you know that what we're going to read out of Ephesians chapter 5, if you've never heard it described this way, it's called a household code. And in the first century in the Greco-Roman culture, household codes were normal. Everybody knew about them. And a household code was a set of expectations or instructions for husbands, for wives, for kids, and for slaves, because that's how a household was made up, right? So this is normal. Everybody knew about them. Surprise, surprise. Surprise, surprise. The household codes privileged men, disadvantaged the ladies, and gave husbands a license to always get their way. Sounds great, right? At least half of us don't like it. Now, what we're going to read from the Apostle Paul, nothing new. Nothing new in the format of how he writes what he writes. Nothing new in the outline. Already existed. Nothing new in the metaphors that he uses. As a matter of fact, in the first century Greco-Roman mindset, everybody just took for granted this metaphor that the husband is the head of the household. And what we're going to read is the Apostle Paul taking things that already existed, and he simultaneously reflects, resists, and redeems it. And he writes in such a way as to disrupt their way of thinking, to completely disrupt their mindset when it came to family, especially marriage. And so we're going to read Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to start in verse 21. Let's just read along together. Verse 21 starts like this. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Before we dig into this passage, I want to ask you, how many of you have ever heard of the Mandela effect? Has anyone ever heard of the Mandela effect? It's something that's named after Nelson Mandela. He became the president of South Africa in 1994. But there are a lot of people who couldn't believe it, that he actually was the president, because they were convinced that he died in prison in the 1980s. And so this effect, this phenomenon of people wrongly remembering something is named after him. Whenever lots of people wrongly remember something, that's called the Mandela effect. Do you think you've ever been under the influence of the Mandela effect? So we're going to play a little game. We're going to do a little quiz to see if we've ever been impacted by it. All right. This is the Fruit of the Loom logo here. How many of you guys remember the logo looking like this? It has never looked like that. That's the Mandela effect. It has always been this. This next one got me. I was under the Mandela effect. Does anybody remember a Fruit Loops box looking like this, spelling out fruit? It's always looked like this. It's never looked like this. Are there any Star Wars fans in the room? Anybody like Star Wars? All right. Do you remember C-3PO having a silver leg? If you think he was gold from top to bottom, that's the Mandela effect. You're just wrongly remembering it. And whenever we wrongly remember something, we don't see what is there, and we see things that aren't there. The passage that we just read, Ephesians chapter 5, it comes with a kind of Mandela effect where people wrongly see things, wrongly remember things. I want to highlight what the text does not say. The text does not say that the husband is the head of the family. It does not say that the husband is the head of the house. It does not say that the husband is the spiritual head of anyone. It does not say that the wife is to obey her husband. It does not say that the husband leads his wife. And it doesn't say that the husband is a servant leader. As a matter of fact, none of those things that I just read are said anywhere in the entire Bible at all. And if this feels like we're bending your brain right now, guess what? That might be the Mandela effect. People wrongly remember what is actually in this passage. And so our task today is to look and see, what does it actually say? And so let's begin at the beginning. We're going to start in verse 21. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. This was written to everybody. I know I don't sound like it, but I am from the Deep South. I was born and raised in the Deep South, and if there was a Deep South translation of the Bible, this verse would sound like, all y'all, submit to all y'all because you love Jesus. That's what it would sound like. It is for everybody. I want to invite you to write this down. Everyone is supposed to submit. No one is supposed to make others submit. Did you know that there is not a single verse anywhere in the Bible that gives us a license to or tells us to try to make somebody else submit? Submission is always voluntary. And if we try to force submission on someone, it becomes something other than submission. It is manipulation. It is oppression. It is something else. But whatever it is, it's not submission, because submission is only submission when it's voluntary. And I think it's incredibly unfortunate that the word and the concept of submission has become an ugly thing in the minds of people, because it is a beautiful thing. It is a beautiful concept. So before we define exactly what submission is, let's be clear on what it's not. Submission is not participating in what you believe is morally wrong. It's also not always agreeing with whatever it is you choose to participate in. It's not enabling your own abuse. It is not enabling the abuse of others. Submission is not a tool to get what we want from someone. Submission is not gender-based. Submission is not obedience. And submission is not automatic. And quickly, I want to speak to anyone who you have abuse in your background, or maybe you are in an abusive relationship right now. And it might be that someone has used the word submit to try and get you to keep taking what you should not be receiving. Submission is not a license for abuse. If you are in an abusive situation where there's sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, serial adultery, or severe substance abuse, you need help, and the right thing might be for you to exit that situation, to get some space so you can get health and help and healing. Would everyone agree that things like jogging and walking are healthy? Does everybody agree with that? Does anybody think I'm crazy? Now, it doesn't mean you do it, but we just know people should do it, right? It's a healthy thing. It's healthy to jog. It's healthy to walk. But what if you have a broken ankle? You probably shouldn't go jogging. We're not asking anybody to run on a broken ankle today. Are you with me? What we're talking about today is going to apply to marriages that are not in an abusive situation. If you're in an abusive situation, I just need you to hear that this is not for you. You need to separate. You need to get some distance, and you need to get some help, health, and healing. But what we're going to talk about is a gospel mindset for the way that marriages should work. And it's going to involve submission. So what is it? What does submission mean? It's this: I voluntarily choose your lead or your need over my agenda. I voluntarily choose your lead or your need over my agenda. And this is for everybody. No one is immune from the command to submit. It's for both wives, it's for both husbands. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And if that rattles our cage a little bit, that's allowed. We're with friends and family today. But one of the things that I hope that we can just really grasp, and we can really embrace and even celebrate, is that no one was more submissive than Jesus. We didn't read this verse, but it's the way Ephesians 5 starts out. Verse 1 says, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." There's nothing more submissive than literally giving up your life. And I can understand why someone might say, can't we just move on from this archaic and obsolete idea of submission and move forward? The answer is no. Because you cannot talk about healthy relationship without talking about submission. Do you know why? Because everybody puts somebody's needs first. Everybody does. Now, if someone were to say, and I can imagine this question being asked, can everybody's needs just be equal all the time? To which anybody who's been married longer than 5 minutes is thinking, isn't that sweet? Bless their heart. That's just not how it works. Somebody's needs are always going to come first. And here's the question. Are you going to put your needs first or your spouse's needs first? You get to decide. My favorite way to picture marriage is a tandem bike because it communicates that we got to be together, we got to be working together, and we're going in the same direction whether we like it or not. We're going to the same destination. And in the gospel, marriage works like this. And this is what submission is. It is a race to the back seat where both the husband wants to put his wife and her needs first. The wife wants to put her husband and his needs first. And they're constantly both deferring to each other. It is a beautiful thing. You got to hear me on this because what I'm going to say next, it does not work this way anywhere else in the world, but it works this way in the gospel, in the way of Jesus. Submission in the gospel is never about rank, status, power, or authority. Submission is always an expression of love. It is love for Jesus and love for our spouse that's expressed by placing ourselves underneath and behind the other. And this is a big deal. This is so big that it's bigger than us. It's so big that it's bigger than our own marriages. And the Apostle Paul strained to make this clear. At the end of the chapter, he wrote this. He said, this is a profound mystery, which means it's hard to understand. It's hard to talk about it. We can know it, but we may not be able to know everything about it. He says, this is a profound mystery. I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Guys, Christian marriages get to be living metaphors of heaven meeting earth. If you're married and you are a follower of Jesus, your marriage gets to be a story in which other people see Jesus more clearly. Your marriage gets to be a picture of the gospel. And so the million-dollar question is, how do we do that? And it might require a change in mindset. So, let's start with the ladies. Apostle Paul writes this. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands and everything. Just waiting for that amen to come. Ladies, what does this mean? I mean, just be as straightforward as I know how to be. This means from the day that you say I do to the day that one of you is buried, there should not be a single moment in which you place yourself first, in front of, or above your husband. And I get it. I know that what I just said freaks people out. I know it massively offends and even enrages some folks. And all I can say to that is, well, I probably agree that that is wrong or misogynistic or oppressive if it wasn't for the next line. The next line is this: husbands, Love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So men, and the same way that Jesus gave up his advantages, his privilege, his agenda, we do the same for our wives. So guys, this is what this means. From the day we say I do to the day that one of us is buried should not be a single moment where we place ourselves in front of, ahead, or above our wives. If you're hearing this through a filter of authority, you're tuned to a different frequency than what I'm talking about today. So this is what I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask you to just kind of sit back, exhale, and just hang with me so that you can hear where I'm really coming from today. One of the reasons that I think that men, sometimes we get this wrong, as we think we're supposed to follow the example of Jesus, and we think about Jesus now, the exalted, glorified Jesus, when Paul is pushing us to follow Jesus in the example of his incarnation, not his glorification. We follow Jesus in his incarnation when he made himself the lowest servant. And that can be hard to get our minds wrapped around. And to the degree that it's hard for us to get our minds wrapped around that, I think it's even harder. Maybe we don't even have the ability to appreciate how scandalous, how radical and revolutionary this was for those people who heard this for the very first time. In the Greco-Roman mindset and that culture in the first century, those who are at the top of a hierarchy, they received all the love. They received all the privilege, all the deference, all the submission, and it never flowed back down to the people who were beneath them. In the org chart of the home, the husband was at the top, and he received love from the wife. He received submission. He received privileges. He did not return those back down. I want to share with you a quote from the philosopher Aristotle, and he wrote about this mindset that was just everywhere. It dominated the Greco-Roman world. What he says, it's not going to make any sense to us, but it was normal for them. He says it would be ludicrous. It's ludicrous if one were to accuse God because he does not return love in the same way he is loved. Or for a subject to make this accusation against a ruler, for it is the part of a ruler to be loved, not to love, or else to love in another way. You see, in that world, if you were at the top, you received all the good stuff. You did not have to return any of the good stuff. And it was virtuous and considered manly for a man to impose his will on those beneath him. It was virtuous and considered manly for a man to take from those beneath him for whatever he wanted. Whatever he wanted. It was institutionalized and it was protected by law. That was just the way the world works. And so imagine what it was like for those believers to hear this from the Apostle Paul from the very first time, that was their culture. I think it must have felt like this. Paul, wait a second. We're supposed to permanently give up our legally protected advantages for the sake of our wives? To which Paul would have said, yes. We're supposed to give up our privileged position for the sake of our wives? Yes. Wait a second, Paul. Are you saying everything that we feel entitled to, we're supposed to extend that same advantage to our wives? And the answer is yes. That is what Jesus has done for you. Okay, just to make sure I'm clear. We're supposed to serve what's in our wives' best interest. Again, the answer is yes. Someone's listening. We're supposed to stop seeing ourselves in the higher position and instead place ourselves in the lower position. The answer is yes. We're supposed to pivot to a lifestyle of saying no to ourselves and saying yes to our wife's preferences and her needs. And the Apostle Paul would have said, you're getting it, fellas? That's it. In a world that was built on hierarchies, how do you apply the gospel to home life in a world like that? You do it like this. And listen, anybody who wants to pound the table and say, but Rick, the passage never explicitly says, husbands, submit to your wives. You are right. It does not say that. But what does this sound like? What does this look like? Men and women, but let me talk to the guys real quick. We're going to be with Jesus. We want to become like Jesus. We want to put into practice the things that Jesus did. No one, and I mean no one, was more submissive than Jesus. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. The next two verses talk about what Jesus has done for the church to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. If we don't know the culture, we might miss something, but it would have jumped off the page to them. It describes Jesus as washing the church with water. Only the lowest slave bathed other people's bodies. It was the lowest of the low slave who washed other people. It was the lowest of the low slave who washed people's feet. And so men, husbands in the room, and any dude who ever wants to one day be a husband, we follow the example of Jesus by placing ourselves in the lowest position and serving. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for the body just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. All of this teaching that Paul is using, it's wrapped in this metaphor of head and body. And the question is, what is that metaphor primarily about? Is that metaphor primarily about authority, or is it primarily about something else? If we connect the wife submits because the husband is the head, if we connect those two things together, we're going to see it about authority. The question is, should those two things go together? I don't think so. There are three couplets in this passage. There are three sets of pairs that are laid out in this passage, and this is what they are: submission and sacrifice, love and respect, head and body. The wife, as the church does to Jesus, submits to her husband, and she's also, out of reverence for Jesus, following the example of Jesus. The husband, following the example of Jesus, sacrifices or gives up himself and all that he's entitled to for the sake of his wife. The husband is to love his wife. The wife is to respect her husband. Interestingly, if you jump to 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter writes something very similar, but he flips it. He says, wives, love your husbands. Husbands, respect your wives. The husband is the head, just as Jesus is the head. The wife is the body, just as the church is the body. Now, without question, Jesus absolutely is the leader. He is our authority. That doesn't mean necessarily that that's what this metaphor is about. Everything that's true of Jesus is not true of husbands. Do you guys agree with me on that? Like Jesus is God. Husbands, we're not God. Jesus is worthy of worship. Men, I don't care if we finally load the dishwasher right. We're not worthy of worship. Although I do ask for a little bit of praise when I get that right. We're wrong. We're just going to be wrong whenever, if ever, we stretch a metaphor beyond what the writer intended. Now, the Apostle Paul makes clear for us what this metaphor is about. And he quotes Genesis chapter 2. The very next line, he quotes Genesis chapter 2 to let us know what he's talking about. He says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and will be what? United to his wife. And the two will become what? One flesh. Now, I think Christians, whenever we focus on authority and who gets it and who doesn't get it, whenever we do that, it almost always comes at the expense of unity. And if you remember Jesus' last night of freedom, he desperately prayed for our unity. And he designed marriage to be about unity between a man and a woman and to be a picture of our unity with him. The head and body metaphor isn't about authority. It's about unity. Did you notice that in this passage, he reversed and contradicted and blew up what they expected? They expected him to say, the husband is the head of the house. He didn't. He said, the husband is the head of his wife. He is the head, she is the body. It's about unity. It's about coming together and being one. Michelle Lee Barnwell is a scholar and theologian. She wrote a brilliant book called Neither Complementarian Nor Egalitarian, talking about this passage. She says this: Paul also says the reversal seen in the love of the husband relates to the one flesh unity of Genesis 2:24. And Genesis, the one flesh unity, was Adam's primary imperative in his relationship with Eve, and he was unable to fulfill it. Now, under the new covenant, the husband's ability to love his wife as Christ loves the church enables him to cleave to his wife and to be one flesh with her in all its fullness. This was God's design from the beginning. It was broken by sin and redeemed by Jesus. Now, if what I'm sharing with you guys, if any of it feels new, if it feels wrong, or if it feels like you just need time to process, that's okay. Take all the time you need to process and chew on this. This is not a dictatorship. You're allowed to disagree with me. And if you are convinced, no, Rick, I think this is absolutely about authority, okay, keep believing that and share it with other people. I would just ask one thing, just one thing. Can you find one verse in the entire Bible, Old Testament or New? Can you find one verse anywhere that says the husband is the authority and the wife should follow his lead? That's all I'm going to ask, is that you find one verse. And if you take me up on my challenge, instead of finding that, you're not going to find verses that say the husband is the authority, wife follow his lead. Whenever they disagree, he has the tie-breaking vote. Instead of finding anything like that, you're going to find stuff like this. 1 Corinthians 7, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. 1 Corinthians 7 is the longest set of instructions to husbands and wives in the entire New Testament. It's written by the Apostle Paul, the same guy who wrote Ephesians 5. He says, husbands, you've given up authority to your body. You've handed that authority to your wife. Wives, you've given up authority over your own body. You've handed that authority to your husband. And in this incredibly personal thing, where they are deciding when they're going to be intimate or not intimate together, the Apostle Paul says, you decide that by mutual consent. This is the only place in the New Testament that actually ever discusses how a husband and wife makes a decision together, and it's decided by mutual consent. I know what some of you guys are thinking. Wait a second, Rick. But aren't there times that a husband is supposed to lead and a wife should follow his lead? Let me turn back to this image of a tandem bike. Before I say what I'm going to say next, Ephesians 5 is not about leadership or authority. 1 Corinthians 7 is not about leadership or authority. They're about something else. But it has been my experience in the past 25 years of pastoral ministry. It's been my observation that women love and value and deeply cherish a man who takes initiative. The women love, value, and cherish a man who is responsible and goes first. And it's not just that women value that. It's that it hurts and it is harmful when a man will not lead. Absolutely. There are going to be lots of times that a man needs to sit in the front seat and take responsibility. But it's also been my observation. It's also been my experience that it's not healthy and good when it's only a man who sits in a front seat. That there are times that we need to let our wives lead, and we benefit when they do. And if that sounds crazy, let me just ask you this. Is there any dude in this room who does not have a truckload of stories of how listening to your wife and follow her lead saved you from something dumb? Am I the only guy like that? We all got stories like that. Because this is what we know, that our wives have skills that we don't have, that our wives have competencies that we don't have. And there are times that we're going to need to say to our babe, I want to follow your lead in this. You're in tune in a way that I'm not in tune, and I can learn from you. And a wife should say to her husband, babe, I need you to lead, and I'm happy to follow your lead. And there are times that husbands say, babe, I need you to lead, and I'm happy to follow your lead. And they're going to lead together, and at times, one's going to take the lead or the other's going to take the lead. That's just the way that marriage works. And if that sounds crazy to you, if you're thinking, no, the husband is always the leader, and when the two disagree, the husband has the tie-breaking vote. And the way it's supposed to go is if we disagree, we always go with me. If that's the way you think it is, would you be surprised to know that couples who do marriage that way, they report lower satisfaction relationally in marriage, lower satisfaction sexually in marriage. And here's the kicker. They have a 7 times higher divorce rate. 7 times. Do you know who John and Julie Gottman are? In 50 years of research into marital stability, they've studied thousands of couples. They are the world's leading experts on marital stability. No one's done more research than them. This is what they have to say. So statistically speaking, when a man is not willing to share power with his partner, there is an 81% chance that his marriage will self-destruct. We did find that the happiest, most stable marriages in the long run were those in which the husband did not resist sharing power and decision-making with the wife. When the couple disagreed, the husbands actively searched for common ground rather than insisting on getting their way. You know what that sounds like to me? That after 50 years of research into thousands of couples, they came to the exact same conclusion as the Apostle Paul. You know what that tells me? Guys, we can trust the way of Jesus. We can trust Jesus because he is good and his way is love. And so for men and women in the room, what if this became our mindset? If you want a marriage that lasts, put yourself last. What if all the wives said, no, I'm always going to put my husband first? Or what if all the husbands said, no, I'm always going to put my wife first? And that each are racing to put the other's needs ahead of their own, is more important than their own. And that there are times, many times maybe, that the wife is going to say, babe, I need to follow your lead on this one. And there are times that the husband is going to say, babe, I need to follow your lead on this one. And I bet you know all kinds of great marriage advice. The importance of not staying angry, of forgiving each other, of being kind, of having an adventure together, a mission together, all the things. You guys know all the things. This is the foundation, this mindset, this gospel mindset of being like Jesus is the foundation for it all. And so in all the questions you got, all the things you got to figure out as you're going through marriage, like, should we both work or should one of us work? How are we doing that? I don't know. You get to decide. Decide together by mutual consent. Who should snow blow the driveway and who should cook and who should wash the dishes? I don't know. You get to decide. And you should decide by mutual consent. How are you going to discipline the kids? Who's going to why are you going to, I don't know. You get to decide. But decide by mutual consent. Who's going to hold the remote? That's always going to be me. You get to set up your home however you want to set up your home. You do not have to be dictated to by traditions. You don't have to be dictated to by any culture whatsoever. But if you are a follower of Jesus, this is what I invite you to do. Place yourself underneath the leadership of Jesus and walk in his way. Be with Jesus. Become like Jesus. And do what Jesus did, and to do that for your spouse.